On this month's European report, filmed in the European Parliament in Brussels, we discuss the anti-Israel movement known as the BDS, that stands for Boycotts, Divestments and Sanctions.
Well, BDS can be explained in different ways, but I think one way of explaining it simply is to say that these are groups, NGOs, that want to isolate Israel, that want to hurt Israel, that want to demonize the Jewish state by implying tactics that were similar to the apartheid regime in South Africa, and making this comparison which has no justification at all.
According to the BDS website, they say that they are the global movement for a campaign of boycotts, divestments and sanctions, BDS, against Israel until it complies with international law and Palestinian rights that was instigated by the Palestinian civil society in 2005. For decades, Israel has denied Palestinians their fundamental rights of freedom, equality, self-determination through ethnic cleansing, colonization, racial discrimination and military occupation, despite the abundant condemnation of Israeli policies by the UN and other international bodies and the permanent human rights organizations. The world community has failed to hold Israel accountable and enforce compliance with the basic principles of law. Israel's crimes have continued with impunity. Let us take a real look at the claims made by the BDS that Israel has denied the Palestinians their fundamental rights, as it was Israel that's given the Palestinians their own freedom when Israel signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, known as the PLO, on the White House lawn in September 1993 in an historic peace agreement.
Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands under the watchful eye of President Bill Clinton. Rabin addressed the issue of revenge in his remarks after the signing ceremony.
We have no desire for revenge. We harbor no hatred towards you. We like you, our people. People who want to build a home, to plant a tree, to love, live side by side with you, in dignity, in empathy, as human beings, as free men. We are today giving peace a chance and saying to you, and saying again to you, enough. Let us pray that a day will come when we all will say farewell to the arms.
Despite the dangers to Israeli security, the government of Yitzhak Rabin, in an historic move towards peace with the Palestinians, brought Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, a proscribed terrorist organization, to govern Gaza and Jericho, the territory Israel had gained in a self-defensive war in the Six-Day War of June 1967. The Rabin government empowered their former enemies to form an administrative control in Arab-dominated areas in the biblical heartland of Israel. When the Egyptians controlled Gaza from 1948 up until 1967, did they help prepare the people of Gaza for self-determination? No. When the Jordanians were in control of Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem, did they prepare the Palestinians for self-determination? And again, the answer is no. It was not until 1988 that the King Hussein of Jordan relinquished any claims to the land after the first Palestinian Intifada of 1987. It was Israel that built the state infrastructure that the Palestinians now take for granted, including roads, schools, hospitals, water facilities and electric grids. In the summer of 2000, the then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian people a Palestinian state, including 97% of the biblical heartland of Israel and East Jerusalem as a future capital. Arafat rejected this offer and ignited the second Intifada with deadly suicide bombings. The leadership of the PLO launched a full-scale terrorism war against the Jewish state that resulted in the death of over 1,307 Israelis. Prior to the Second Intifada, Yasser Arafat built up a terrorist infrastructure and indoctrinated his people with hatred and violence against Israel. As a result of the wave of terrorism and suicide bombings, Israel launched a military offensive against the Palestinian terrorist organizations and built what was known as the security fence to protect Israel's borders. The Palestinians can only blame their own leadership for their situation, as instead of pursuing peace with Israel and building a modern infrastructure and investing in education, they instead wanted to perpetuate the conflict. Palestinian children have been indoctrinated on a diet of hatred and incitement of violence against Israel and the Jewish people.
أصدقائنا الأطفال اللغز بيقول يا عرس الحبيبة يا نسمة الرياحين يا بنت يافا يا زهرة الياسمين عشتي بعد الموت من العمر 30 وزفوكي مع رفاقك بعلم فلسطين. إذن حبايب الأطفال بالنسبة لجواب اللغز، جواب اللغز هو دلال المغربي.
According to the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, more money has been given to the Palestinian Authority by Western nations, including Britain, than the US Marshall Aid Plan that was used to fund the entire rebuilding of Western Europe after World War II. If the BDS really cared about the cause that they claim to believe in, they would be out campaigning against the shocking human rights abuses and corruption against the Palestinian people by their own leadership. The BDS is not interested in the genuine plight of the Palestinian Arabs, only the destruction of Israel through the use of economic means to erode Israel's moral standing in the world. As Barghouti, the leader of the BDS, says that he's only interested in a one-state solution that sees Israel replaced by a Palestinian Arab state.
I clearly do not buy into the two-state solution. I clearly do not buy into the two-state solution.
The two-state solution, as typically expressed, is nothing more than a last-ditch plan to save Zionism.
So BDS isn't about peaceful coexistence or ending the occupation.
If the occupation ends, let's say, would that end your call for BDS? No, it wouldn't.
No. BDS moves beyond ending occupation to place demands for what they term the right of return, the relocation of millions of Palestinians from around the world into Israel.
This is the most basic, fundamental right that we cannot negotiate away. This is something that we cannot compromise on.
The right of return would extinguish Israel as a Jewish state, and that's not an option.
This implication is not lost on Barghouti.
If the refugees were to return, you would not have a two-state solution. You'll have a Palestine next to a Palestine, rather than a Palestine next to Israel.
The BDS like to make false and dangerous slurs against Israel, that Israel commits genocide against the Palestinian people, but they are totally silent when it comes to the real ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Iraq. They do not tell about the awful conditions that the Palestinians find themselves in Lebanon, Jordan and Syria, where they face discrimination and are treated worse than second-class citizens. In Syria, the Palestinians have been caught up in this awful civil war, with the Syrian regime using fighter planes to actually bomb their refugee camps, resulting in the murder of hundreds of Palestinians. This has nothing to do with Israel, but where is the international outrage? There isn't one, because the BDS and the world do not care. Sadly, the European Union has embraced the BDS by publishing what is called the EU guidelines, that effectively calls for economic sanctions against Israeli goods and services produced in Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. This policy, together with the BDS campaign against the successful Israeli company SodaStream, which has been badly affected due to pressure, they have moved their operation from Judea and Samaria closer to Tel Aviv. They employed a Palestinian workforce on salaries 3 times the average wage of those paid by the Palestinian Authority. This helped to foster good relations between Israelis and Palestinians and was a step towards reconciliation and peace. Sadly, due to the pressure from the EU and the BDS, the SodaStream factory had to close, and with it its Palestinian workforce who depended on this job for their incomes. The EU should be honouring and rewarding SodaStream for being a successful business in bringing Israelis and Palestinians together and helping to build peaceful coexistence. Instead, SodaStream was condemned, making it harder for Israeli businesses to employ a Palestinian workforce. BDS is not hurting Israel but the Palestinians economically, so it is clear that the BDS is not interested in the welfare of the Palestinian people. Credit to our Prime Minister David Cameron, who wants to outlaw the activities of the BDS in saying that it breaches the World Trade Organization rules on procurement. The leadership of the BDS and the EU would do well to remember the words of the psalmist in Psalm 121 verse 4. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The nation of Israel has been a blessing to the world, and the BDS and the EU are not coming against Israel but the Almighty, and it's an awful thing to fall into the hands of the God of Israel.